What's up, you guys? Nicola Maserati here. We are in part 2 of how to make your videos look cinematic. Today we're going to be talking about how to get the most cinematic images straight out of your camera. But before we get started, let's run that intro. Alright guys, so first of all, I am so sorry. It's been like almost 2 weeks since I've uploaded. It's just been absolutely crazy with Christmas and New Year's and everything like that. It's been absolutely insane. But I'm back and I'm going to be putting up as many videos as I should be, at least 2 videos a week, maybe even 3 videos a week. But anyway, I digress. So like I said, today we're going to be talking about how to get the most cinematic images straight out of your camera. We're going to be talking about frame rates, we're going to be talking about shutter speed, aperture, color profiles. It's gonna be awesome. So when I first started filmmaking, I had no idea what aperture, frame rate, and shutter speed was. I would just set my camera to auto and get going. If my camera wanted to do 24 frames per second, it was doing 24. If it wanted to do 60, it was doing 60. So the first thing that we're gonna be talking about is frame rates. There's different frame rates that you can have in your video clips. You can have 24 frames per second, 60 frames, or even 120 frames, but the most cinematic frame rate is 24 frames per second. So most movies that you've seen are shot and edited and shown in 24 frames per second. You can always film at higher frame rates, like 60 frames or 120 frames, but even when you go back into editing, you're always conforming it to 24 frames per second. So 24 frames per second is the closest thing that we see in real every day-to-day life. So it's going to give you the most realistic motion blur. And when I'm talking about motion blur, I'm talking about how my hand can go up and down like this, and you see a blur. When you go into higher frame rates, that blur is going to start to go away and it doesn't look as realistic. So places where you may see higher frame rates other than 24 frames per second are on the news or soap operas. I used to always wonder when I would look at soap operas, I'm like, why does it look so funny? It's because they're filming in higher frame rates, like 60 frames per second. The only time you would want to film in 60 frames or 120 frames is when you're going to slow something down. I've noticed a lot of people on YouTube shooting in 60 frames per second, thinking that it looks cleaner and sharper, more YouTube-ish. But in my opinion, it doesn't look that great. But if you're trying to get the most cinematic look out of your camera, you want to make sure you're shooting at 24 frames per second. So next, we're going to be talking about shutter speed. Shutter speed does a couple of different things. Shutter speed is another thing that determines motion blur in your videos, and it also determines how light or dark your image is. So the lower your shutter speed is, the more motion blur you're going to have, and the higher your shutter speed is, the less motion blur you're going to have. In filmmaking, you want to try to stick to what's called the 180-degree rule. To put it simply, the 180-degree rule is, depending on where your frame rates are at, you want to double that for your shutter speed. So for example, right now I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, so my shutter speed is set to 50. If I'm shooting at 60 frames per second, if I want to do slow-mo, then my shutter speed is going to be set to 120. And the reason you do that is because that is going to give you the most realistic motion blur in regards to your frame rates. I know, who would have thought it's all about motion blur? So when I didn't know a whole lot about filmmaking, I remember that I was out shooting video with my friends and my old photography habits kind of caught up with me. In photography, we know that you want to adjust your aperture and your shutter speed before you adjust your ISO too much. Adjusting your ISO too high can bring down the quality of your photos. But in video, it's different. If you're shooting in 24 frames per second, you want to make sure that you double that for your shutter speed. Just try to always be aware of that and try not to adjust the shutter speed while you're filming to adjust for the light. Try to set the shutter speed where it's at and leave it alone, forget about it. If it gets too dark or too light, to adjust that, you want to either adjust the aperture or you want to adjust the ISO. Leave the shutter speed alone. Alright, so next we're going to talk about the aperture or the f-stop. The f-stop or aperture is a little number that you'll see next to an F on your lens. You can think of aperture kind of like an eyeball. The more you close your eye, the less light that's coming in. The more that you open your eye, the more light's coming in. So your aperture also determines two things. Your aperture is going to determine how much light's coming in, and it's also going to determine how shallow your depth of field is. Typically, for the most cinematic images, you want to use as low a f-stop as possible. So for example, right now I'm shooting on my lens and I've got it set to f2.8. The lower f-stop is going to bring in more light into the camera, but it's also going to separate your subject from the background. For example, I've got my f-stop set to 2.8. So that's going to give nice focus on me, but it's going to blur out the background a little bit. Now, a reason you would want to use a higher aperture is if you're trying to keep everything around in focus. So for example, if I wanted the stuff that's behind me to be a little bit more in focus, I would bring the aperture up. But as I bring the aperture up, the image will get darker, so then I'll have to adjust my ISO to compensate for that. So typically, the lower the f-stop, the better. That's going to give you the most cinematic look in your videos. So next we're going to talk about color profiles. Every camera comes with different color profiles. Typically, when you're trying to get the most cinematic look in your films, you want the color to be on point. So the flatter your image is straight out of your camera, the easier it's going to be to edit in post. So some cameras come with what's called a log profile. And all a log profile is a flatter profile that allows you to have more control in editing. It's almost similar to shooting raw photos in photography. Everybody in the photography world knows that you shouldn't be shooting JPEG and then going and editing later. You want the flattest image possible. Before you guys start going through your cameras and trying to find the log profiles, not every camera has it. Some Sony cameras have it, like the A series, the GH5 has it. So I'm shooting on a Canon 6D Mark II. The Canon 6D Mark II doesn't come with a log profile. So all I do there is I adjust my camera settings to give me as flat a profile as possible. So one of the things that you can do to give your images a flatter profile straight out of the camera is to bring down the contrast all the way and to bring down the sharpness maybe 1 or 2 points. That's going to give you a lot more flexibility when you bring your videos into your editing software. Like I said, in order to get the most cinematic images out of your camera for color profiles, you want to make sure it's as flat as possible. Okay, so we went over frame rates, shutter speed, aperture, color profiles. Is there anything else? No, I think that's about it. Alright guys, so I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. If you did enjoy this video, hit that like button. It really helps me out. And if you're not subscribed already, hit that subscribe button. No, wait. I'm gonna wait until you hit the subscribe button. I hit lettuce earlier. Oh, did you guys hit the subscribe button? Okay, cool. Well, I'll see you guys in the next video. Stay tuned for part 3 of how to make your videos cinematic. I'll see you guys later.